Hello everyone, this is RaySpace and welcome back to my Shuttle-launched Lunar Landing mission in Kerbal Space Program 1.12 with Real Solar System and Realism Overhaul. We have here the lander with its associated xenon ion stage. The xenon ion stage had this little problem where during time warp it would flip opposite to what I set SAS to. So if I set prograde, it would flip to retrograde, which was a little bit puzzling to me. I tried to change the control direction, of course. We do need it to operate during time warp because the stage time is 63 days because I made it super realistic ion engines. And it had this weird overheating problem that occasionally cropped up. It never actually exploded or anything because it cools down during time warp. I decided to solve the problem by just telling it to hold retrograde. I wanted it to go prograde, but since it was being contrary, I just went with it, and so I told it to hold retrograde, and it held prograde, and I time warped like that. So a bit of a weird thing going on there, but at least it was working out. It did have the problem where it wasn't shutting off the engine on the nighttime side. KSP Interstellar does that. But I removed the KSP Interstellar thing module because it wasn't working out for me for other reasons. So I didn't have the benefit of that other lopsidedness that would occur. But it ended up decently lopsided anyway. So here we are cycling out over the course of so far a month and a half. And at this point, especially once we're beyond geosynchronous orbit, but basically when we're a large fraction of the moon's own orbital period, I stopped time warping and cycling and instead plot it out. This is the only at this point you can plot it out. If you plot it out earlier, there's no point. It had another weird problem where it tried to stay on regardless of whether I had throttled down or not. So there's been some issues, but that's why I went to the tracking station, because that way it wouldn't be on. And here we have what was supposed to be an encounter. It didn't look very much like an encounter, but it turns out it was. There we go. So yes, we had an encounter, but it was a very glancing encounter. But you can see a good one because we've got a low periapsis there and nearly in orbit around the moon, which is especially good because the ion engine sure can't capture if it's a really quick orbit or orbit that's very different from the moon's orbit. But this is good enough. Well, you can see our orbital speed is just 80 meters per second here. That it can handle. So the key here is to make sure to point away from the moon's surface, and then you can capture. So we got a full capture by slowing down basically 7 meters per second or something like that. And then there's the arduous process of bringing our orbit down, so that's a little more convenient. So a lot of periapsis passes to bring the orbit down, taking forever. That's the price. You could, at apoapsis, lift the periapsis up and then try to cycle it down. During this point in the Twitch live stream, somebody asked me what mods I was using. I decided to go through them because I was getting tired of the tediousness. So here's the original audio from that. If you want to skip it, skip to 7 minutes and 30 seconds. Well, click through blocker, filter extensions, harmony, KSP burst, textures unlimited, toolbar control, KSP recall, advanced jet engines, ASEP, B9 procedural wings, B9 part switch. That's the animation controller that comes with something. That's procedural part textures, camera focus changer, camera tools, canaveral pads, chatter, community category kit, community resource pack, community tech tree, custom pre-launch checks, whatever the heck that is, distant object enhancement, docking functions. That's my mods, which in this case includes aerospikes. For some reason isn't necessary for this. Crew vessels. We are using the capsules from. That isn't necessary. That's not necessary. Not necessary for this. No. Shuttle payloads, yes, because we're using the Centaur from that. And then shear strut engine pack. Probably I'm using some RCS thrusters and engines from. And I've been using the terrain here for Edwards Air Force Base. Okay. Engine group controller, environmental visual enhancements, Ferrum Aerospace, Firefly, Freedom textures for procedural parts, hangar extender, Hullcam BDS, not really relevant to this mission, but interstellar fuel switch, IR connection system for hinges, raster prop monitor, changelog, That's procedural part textures, Kerbal joint reinforcement, Kerbal constructs, KerbCam, KIS, Copernicus, KOS, KSC switcher, KSP, community fixes, KSP will. KW rocketry is just for one SRB, really, for Separatrons. Lackluster Labs, that's for the Ion engine. So Infernal Robotics, procedural part textures, MechJeb, that's required for something or another, and I never use Navy Fish actually. Near future propulsion is one solution for like Basimirs and Ions. That's for structures at the KSC. Parallax, Patch Manager, P.E.K.K.'s Starship stuff, which we're not using right now. Planet Shine, procedural fairings, procedural parts, RCS build aid. Real shoots, real fuels, real heat, realism overhaul, those are required for realism overhaul, real plume. RPO soft tech is required for something else. US probes we're not using, but that has a lot of shuttle related stuff. US rockets had the Centaur stage that I'd used before. Before I made my own. RO util is required for realism overhaul. That's Cape Canaveral. This is all RSS Reborn. Scatterer is required by RSS Reborn. Ship Manifest. Smoke Screen. Solver engines. The space shuttle itself. Squad, of course. SSTU, I don't think we're using right now, but it has some docking ports. TAC life support. Tundra Airspace. Tweak Scale. Those are structures. That's like the structure at Launch Complex 39A for the shuttle. That's real launch sites. Vessel View, that's KSP Interstellar. Waterfall. Xenon Hall Thrusters is for near future propulsion. And then my patches for KSP Interstellar, for near future, for Lackluster Labs. And then P.E.K.K.'s Warp Thrust mod. So that's what's there. A reason that I don't produce a list of all my mods in each of the videos is because there's so many installs of the Kerbal Space Program. I change the mods all the time, and some of the mods I use because I made them aren't released yet, and so people can't even use them. This is a list of the current working installs I have. I've got 18 of them, and they're all big. So yeah, I mean, whether people could even run these installs, within each of the mods, I actually trim parts out. Like I've trimmed parts out of KSP Interstellar in order to make it work with so many other mods. And, you know, KW Rocketry I trimmed parts out of, and so on and so forth. The person who asked me about that during the live stream asked me to include it in the video, so I included it in the video. Right there, I decided to stop trying to bring the apoapsis down, and I checked how much delta V the lander had to make sure that the lander would be able to get down, land from that orbit, and then go back to that orbit, and I thought that delta V was enough. It turns out it was pretty tight, but doable. Here we have the pod that's going to carry the crew over, and that has my special Centaur stage previously described. Before I went over, I decided to cheat the little lander into orbit to see if this was the right time to go over there, and it would match the orbit of our target, our lander, and it did actually. It turns out that this was the perfect time, the periapsis match, so that when we capture, our apoapses will coincide. And yeah, this is what I want, and really it would only happen once every month or so. So it was real lucky that it turned out to be the right time without me actually time warping anymore. Altogether, I think the whole mission is something like 3 months long, by the way, and that's because we don't stay on the surface very much. So it's just pop out and pop back in. Of course, in real life, they would probably spend a little bit more time than that. Here, I'm just adjusting the mid-course correction to really see whether that periapsis stays where it ought to, and it does. So right smack, perfect for what we want. And so I launch the pod over. Again, all of this was done during live streams. And the live stream video should still be available on Twitch, hopefully, if you wanted to see all the tedious details. Up goes the shuttle. It is the Shuttle Columbia. I decided to go with Columbia. I certainly don't hold it responsible for its fate. That was not its responsibility. If anything, it was the external tank's fault. So, and you know, we can't really tell one of those apart from the other, can we? Off go the boosters. Well, except for the first two. The first two were painted white, so, or cream, so they were different. There's subtle differences, I know. Let's not get into it. Alright, rolling over. And just to be clear, this is the old Space Shuttle mod that was subsequently modified by many, many different people, including Mike NZ, and ultimately this version is the Giulio Dondi version of that old mod. And Giulio Dondi also created the versions of the shuttle ascent guidance and descent guidance, and so those I used to control it. I have personally previously used KOS scripts of my own to launch the shuttle and handle re-entry, but these are obviously better, so I'm going with them. Out goes the payload. Of course, I transferred the crew while the OMS engines were doing their burn to make orbit, and I checked that everything was okay. So yeah, we are all set to go, and therefore I plot the transfer. It still looks the same as when I cheated the lander into orbit to check. And so that's all good. I was a little bit worried that it was lying to me or something. And we have ignition. So, two RL-10s. These are RL-10A4s, I think. And they're from Raidernix US Rockets pack. I was originally planning to use the Centaur from Raidernix US Rockets pack, but it was a little bit too big for this purpose, and of course wasn't meant as a service module, so I made my own part. This is one of those cases where I made my own part, but it is included in a mod. It's in the shuttle payloads mod on my GitHub. And of the things that I've made here that aren't released, I think all the critical things are released. The crew capsule is from the crew vessels pack on my GitHub, and then the ion engines are a configuration for Lackluster Labs that should be part of the RP2000 package. So in RP2000 there are configurations for KSP Interstellar, Lackluster Labs, and USI, and I've modified that a little bit actually to make them worse, to make them more realistic. They're nicer with the Lackluster Labs one. So what you saw there was me measuring out the runway again, because in the previous video we saw that I hadn't gotten the right runway location for the shuttle re-entry. So I had my little rover, jet-powered rover, try to measure things out again, and here is the shuttle re-entry. You can only activate OPS-3, the deorbit script, when you're at 122 kilometers. And we are headed to Edwards Air Force Base, as you saw, even though I launched from Cape Canaveral. That does mean, in this case, that the shuttle has to go pretty far north off of its course, so it has to use its cross range. And so it's, in this case, it always tries to turn one way or another, but it's definitely leaning leftwards or towards the north, because our orbit is only at 28 degrees and Edwards Air Force Base is at 34 degrees. So it basically has to tilt its orbit by 6 degrees in order to get to Edwards Air Force Base. And it uses its cross range to do that, but it seems to find that easy enough because it did do a roll reversal midway, and so presumably it could go even further, and we know that the shuttle should have been able to. So no problems there. You can see the patch of Edwards. It's a very bright day. Not quite as bright as when I took the rover out to try and measure the runway. That one, the runway looked practically white. The shuttle should probably be using one of the lakebed runways, but I frequently have trouble seeing the markings on the ground with this scenery, so I decided that we would just go for one of these more standard runways because we can actually see it properly. So yeah, I measured this one out and aimed for it. And here comes the shuttle for landing. So finally we can get a proper landing here because now our terrain woes are fixed. As we come in for a touchdown, sorry about the pixelated runway. I could put like a Kerbal Constructs runway on top of it. This was the best quality photo scenery I could get of Edwards, and I decided to just keep the original imagery intact. But there we have it. The shuttle has landed. We have our spacecraft on its way to the moon to meet up with the lander. And at this point, I'll leave it for the next video. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please do press like. If you have any comments or suggestions, please leave them in the comment section below. and I'll see you next time.